Hi, this is Margaret Kennedy-Dygas, and here we are in our last unit, Part 6, and this is the 20th and 21st centuries. Things begin to sound a little more familiar here. One of the things we want to think about when we begin to move towards the 20th century is what's happening to tonality. That's one of the most important issues in the music of this period. Um, and we really want to think about the kind of styles and trends as well, because the world's getting smaller. People are getting to know each other across nations, and what people in one area of the world are doing is much more instantaneously transported to other places. So these become trends that almost transcend nationalism in a certain sense. The first kind of style and trend actually began in the late 19th century. It's really not a 20th century style as much, but because it had such a huge impact on the 20th century, we think of it in terms of the 20th century. And that style or trend is called Impressionism. This is the movement that was begun by Debussy and other composers in France associated with him. It was a style that was kind of the answer to the late Romantic German style, which was a very kind of traditional approach still to tonality, even though there was a lot of dissonance and so on in German music of the late 19th century. Still, there was a sense that tonality was finally the pillar that one got to after all this struggle and anguish and dissonance. But with Impressionism, it's a little different. Impressionism is about enjoying the moment and not necessarily needing to have things that were thought of as dissonant resolving to things that were thought of as consonant. And you'll hear a lot of that in Debussy's Afternoon of a Faun. In the early 20th century, there were several other really important styles and trends that began. There was a short-lived movement called Primitivism, and you're going to experience one of the great works that came out of that movement, Stravinsky, Rite of Spring, and you'll be listening to a portion of Part 1. Wonderful approach to making music that gets very elemental, very almost prehistoric in its approach. But Stravinsky and other composers abandoned primitivism by the second or third decade of the 20th century in favor of a movement called neoclassicism, a turn back to kind of the basics, clarity, and balance, but with dissonant twists. We don't actually have a piece we'll be studying from the neoclassical work, just because we don't have enough time to get to it. But I wanted you to know what that term meant. We're going to have a little taste of atonality, which was a huge part of the earlier 20th century. This was a movement where various composers decided, what would it be like to write music that actually doesn't have to have a home base or a tone upon which everything's, kind of based. What would it be like to have music that really had kind of an egalitarian view of all tones, that all tones were equal and none were made more important in terms of chords and harmonies and so on. So we'll hear a piece that's actually based on that approach, a movement of Webern's Five Pieces for Orchestra. Very brief movement, but I think it'll be interesting to perhaps some of you or many of you in terms of what Webern has accomplished in that piece. Then we're going to get a little bit into jazz, not as much as I would like, but just a little flavor of Bessie Smith's blues, which were so seminal in the early 20th century, and then, of course, Louis Armstrong and his band, a selection hotter than that. So in jazz, we see a real original American music form. It was born out of some elements that couldn't be duplicated anywhere else. Born out of cultures that came together in the United States through the African American experience. We're going to continue our exploration of what we might call Americanism by looking at how jazz, in particular, influenced classically based works. In particular, we'll be listening to a movement of William Grant Still's Afro-American Symphony, which was an earlier 20th century work. And I think that piece will be something you'll really enjoy. Americanism had its influences in many realms. There were many other strands of music indigenous to the United States. For example, music that developed in the Appalachian Mountains over the time when those peoples were isolated from others. There was a movement with the Shakers, a religious movement in the 19th century, out of which came a lot of interesting kind of hymn tunes, including one called Simple Gifts. Aaron Copland, who was kind of the dean, if you might want to say, the dean of 20th century Americanism, wrote a wonderful ballet called Appalachian Spring, and he uses this Shaker hymn tune, Simple Gifts, in a kind of a variations mode, theme and variations, as a portion of that ballet. We'll be studying that, and I think you'll enjoy it because it's so clear and so tuneful that you can really hear the development of that tune through the different variations. Then we move into the latter part of the 20th century with some quotation music by a composer named Cvilich. And she has written a piece called Concerto Grosso 1985. We'll be listening to the first movement. This is an interesting piece because it incorporates actually some pre-existing music, Concerto Grosso by George Friedrich Handel, an old friend of ours from the Baroque period. But Cvilich uses this music and reinterprets it in her own style. So there'll be portions of Handel's music you'll hear, and then portions of Cvilich's music, which is much more dissonant and at times not particularly tonal. So very interesting example of quotation music. We'll be getting a little taste of minimalism in a piece that John Adams wrote, Short Ride in a Fast Machine. This is actually considered a sort of post-minimalist piece. But minimalism is kind of a movement that said in the latter part of the 20th century, well, actually what's wrong with tonality? Tonality is okay. Having a home base is okay. And maybe music has gotten just way too complicated. So let's come down to a minimal group of resources and elements for music and see what we can do to create music that uses minimal resources so that the audience can really follow what's going on. So I think you'll enjoy this minimalist or post-minimalist piece. I have a couple of ideas that I want you to be considering as you're listening to all this music in Part 6, since we're approaching it a little less historically and a little bit more stylistically. I want you to think about the music as you hear it. Does it seem directional in the way that music of earlier periods was? Does it seem to move you in a particular direction? Do you expect to go somewhere with this music? Or is it maybe more non-directional? And then another kind of idea to play with is, how is the piece built as far as I can hear, as far as I understand from my reading? Is it highly structured or more loosely structured? And I think what you'll find if you kind of consider those two concepts is we'll be dealing with music that on the one hand might be very non-directional, meaning my ear doesn't really know where it's going to go next. It doesn't seem to have a clear direction. And which could also be highly structured, such as the music of Webern, I think would be very non-directional, but yet highly, highly structured. Whereas we can have music that's directional, but very loosely structured, which we'll see in the maybe jazz examples that we're going to be dealing with. So kind of an interesting maybe matrix to think about as you're listening to this music, kind of a different way of approaching our study and our music considerations. Thank you very much, and I hope you'll enjoy this unit as much as I do.